although certainly not young overall. Brian had asked me to come and share with you a study session that I had prepared at the request of Mayor Hodson for the City Council. And the study session really focused on kind of the aggregation of the types of services that needed to be anticipated as this community continues to grow, and the impact on the growth to both the residents of the community and the demand for the various types of services. So I need first, as I start this presentation, to acknowledge and thank both Brian and Brian Brown, but also Matilda Diaz, who was just absolutely instrumental in reviewing the many drafts of this document that we went through before coming to what I'm going to share with you today. Certainly Brian and Matilda are technical experts in this area, and I feel no shame in telling you that I used their services extensively to put together what you see. Also reached out to Canby Utility, to our own wastewater treatment staff and others as I tried to correlate and gather information that I thought would be relevant as we look at the long-term implications of growth in the community. The city of Canby has, thank you, that helps a lot, has different types of land designations both within the city and outside of it. There is a section in the green that is land that's undesignated, and that's a kind of an important distinction, because that means that it is neither in the long-term rural designation for properties, nor is it within the urban growth boundaries for the city of Canby. You can see, and it's not terribly clear here, but the slightly lighter areas, oops, wrong button, the slightly lighter areas right in here are areas that actually lie within the urban growth boundaries, and so are available for future growth for the city of Canby, but have not yet been annexed by the city. This line around this perimeter here is designated as the urban growth boundary, so the limits of the growth. So really important in our discussions are these areas that are slightly lighter, and these dark green areas that are the undesignated lands, which we can't use right now. They're not part of our 20-year growth, but they're not restricted as those lands designated as rural are restricted, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. We looked at Canby population estimates. The county projected estimate is 16,820, although the certified population estimate in 2013 is 15,910, and we just received the 2014 estimate at 16,010. So we're actually growing a little bit slower than the Clackamas County projections, which isn't really too unexpected given the nature of the recession that has hit this region and in fact the entire country. The Clackamas County population estimate based on the study that they did in 2032 is 26,730. They're anticipating a 2.3% annual population growth, which is a net gain of just under 10,000 people during the period from now until 2032. And just kind of a side note, Canby Utility uses a 2.8% growth factor based on the actual growth that occurred between 1990 and 2009. in looking what's happened and seeing the fluctuations in population, I think the number will actually be somewhere between those two, and there are a couple reasons that I think that, and we'll go into that detail a little bit more as we go. As I discussed, the Canby urban growth boundary is the area designated for current use and future expansion. And by definition, the land inventory that is currently available is estimated to absorb approximately 20 years city growth. That's kind of one of the underlying assumptions in establishing the urban growth boundaries, is it will accommodate 20 years of growth. Land within the urban growth boundary but not yet annexed into the city does require voter approval for annexation, and we saw that in action here in November when 2 annexation proposals were approved by the electorate. Rural reserves are an important element. It's land reserved to provide long-term protection for agriculture, forestry, or important natural landscape features. I took this exactly out of the state definition because it's pretty telling the way they describe it. To limit urban development or help define appropriate natural boundaries of urbanization, including plant, fish, and wildlife habitat, steep slopes, and floodplains. This was a formal process to establish the areas in which urbanization would not occur for a very extended period of time, and which requires an act of the legislature to change, so not likely to change in the near term. The rural reserves are the areas that were neither in the green nor included in the within the gold boundaries that I identified. The undesignated lands, as I discussed, is land not included in either the rural reserve or within the urban growth boundaries. It's not under the same restrictions that we've established for the rural reserves, but they would not be generally available for city expansion until such time as the urban build-out has substantially occupied all of the lands within the urban growth boundaries. So until we fill in that checkered area that within that picture that's defined by the urban growth boundaries and yet not currently annexed into the city of Canby, we're not wholly precluded from attempting to legislatively access the undesignated lands, but as a matter of practical application, it would be very, very difficult to be able to modify our urban growth boundaries to incorporate any portion of the undesignated boundaries. The alternative to having the undesignated lands component in here, that section in green, would be that we would have been very strictly bound by our own urban growth boundaries and would not have had an opportunity even to consider, a serious opportunity even to consider the potential to, if growth expands and fills the urban growth boundary within that 20-year period, wouldn't even have had a practical opportunity to step outside those urban growth boundaries to the undesignated lands. And this is something that I think Matilda actually had a fairly significant input into by successfully arguing for the establishment of the undesignated lands. We haven't completely landlocked ourselves as a community. There's still some potential, although, as I said, it would be a pretty heavy lift to have undesignated lands designated within the urban growth boundaries. But something to keep in mind as you look at growth patterns within the city of Canby and opportunities that might exist, not this year or next year or 5 years from now, but I'd say in the 10 to 20 year downrange, that discussions will start occurring that could affect how undesignated lands are planned in the future. A city council goal is to have a 3-year supply of platted lots. Our supply on October 31st, 2014 was 39 vacant plotted lots. We have the potential for 178 new platted lots within 2 years based on pre-application subdivision reviews received in Brian's department. And if we add in annexations that had voter approval on November 4th, the inventory would increase to approximately 248 total lots. Estimated household occupancy of 2.79 people per residential unit, and with a 3-year population growth estimate of 1,178, again, based on Clackamas County data. If we look at our own city certified population, the gross number is 1,115. And you'll notice I'll do this in a couple places because while the number doesn't appear too significant in the short term, in the long term, as you look at 20-year growth, it makes a pretty material difference in planning for population growth and considering future annexations. Also makes a difference when you consider urbanization and population densities. Dwelling units, which I misspelled, needed for 3-year growth based on population estimate is about 422, or 400 using Canby's 2013 population estimate of 15,910, which means we'd be between 152 and 175 dwelling units shy of our targeted 3-year inventory goal based on single-family residences. We have some proposals for multifamily housing that will help to bridge that gap because the occupancy per acre is much denser in multifamily housing than it is in single-family housing. So as you start to factor in denser population growth, then those numbers become a little bit more achievable than looking at the traditional single-family residence with 5,500 to 6,500 square feet per lot, which is kind of the densities we're looking at these days. So all things being considered, looking only at single-family housing, we're 150 to 175 platted lots short to meet our 3-year goal. As I had mentioned, the areas distinguished with crosshatching is within the urban growth boundary, but not yet annexed into Canby. And again, that's this little section here, this section in here, this area in here, and then there's a couple small areas right in here that it is within the urban growth boundaries and would be designated for future growth. Some of this, as you look, is really kind of queued up for industrialization a little more freely than for residential construction, however. So looking at it, you have to consider the type of use of the different properties. The area filled in green is the undesignated land. It's neither within the Canby urban growth boundary nor included in the rural reserve. And as I've described to you, it would literally take an act of the legislature to have this land moved into the urban growth boundaries. However, it would be a much more realistic inclusion into the city's urban growth boundaries than the rural areas. Than the rural areas that are outside of those boundaries. Once looking at the land available, I started looking at infrastructure factors that will affect our ability to serve the populations that would be coming in if our population estimates are reasonably accurate. So looking first at water, per capita household water use, and we have to break that up into two components. We don't have to, but I think it makes more sense as you look at it. The per capita inside demand is about 85 gallons per day, with a total demand of about 1.37 million gallons with a 16,000 population. The per capita average day demand, which is inside and outside, is about 134 gallons per day with a total demand of just over 2 million gallons per day. What Canby Utility looks at, however, is maximum day demand, which is how much water is going to be needed or demanded in their service area on the highest water demand day. And right now, that peak is 361 gallons per day. And that is the hottest day of the year when everybody is running sprinklers and doing whatever it takes to stay cool for the day. So the total demand on the maximum day demand is about 5.78, almost 6 million gallons per day.
What's the I guess this narrowest channel in that? Is that the holding tank that can, or what? I guess what I'm asking is,
it's
I guess the narrow point in that, the channel.
the narrow point is processing the water for consumption.
So we can cleanse.
We can cleanse
8 million a day.
8 million a day right now.
Okay.
And that's an excellent question. It's possible to build more holding tanks, but not practical at this juncture because we can't treat for use more than the 8 million gallons is a maximum. So based on a maximum day demand of roughly 360 gallons per day, our maximum population would be about 22,000 before we reach supply limit. The population could increase without a corresponding increase if density or a reduction in lawns and what I call green spaces were to occur. As outside, because inside demand is kind of constant at that 85 gallons per day, and what you'll notice when we look at the wastewater demand is that the inside demand and the wastewater demand are pretty much the same, very similar, and it's all of the other uses that drive the use above between 85 and 300 gallons. So everything else that's being used. So as population densities increase, then the inside demand, per capita inside demand, stays relatively the same, but the outside demand diminishes because you're not caring for as much green space, and so the individual demand for water, in addition to what the individual needs to care for themselves, doesn't increase in proportion to the population.
Is our industrial consumption of water factored into that?
We looked at that, and one of the questions that was posed is, what if and the answer is, in the total usage, it is, and it's fairly nominal. Because we looked at what happens if we bring a bottling plant on and it uses 200,000 gallons a day, which is a very, very high usage, and the answer is it's fairly negligible when you start looking at an $8 million a day, 8 million gallon a day capacity. So it is, but it's not a major user because we don't have an industry yet that has that kind of demand. There could be, I don't know what would be a greater usage than a water bottling facility, but if one were to come on, that could be a factor, and it's something that certainly would have to be considered. But at this juncture, we weren't really able to identify anything in our industrial uses today that would result in a material impact, adverse material impact in our ability to serve. One of the things that we're recognizing now in industrial usage, as well as a water reclamation process, in which many industrial uses will recycle the same water and they'll use it repeatedly. It doesn't apply to to filling bottles of water for people to drink, but it does apply for many of the industries that currently would contemplate locating here. So based on our projected population growth and current maximum daily demand, again looking at the maximum daily demand based on what has happened in the past, our projected need of an additional 2 million gallons a day exists by 2030. I will tell you that Canby Utility has plans to begin its preliminary plans and are beginning to look at different ways to increase their maximum generating capabilities over the next several years to meet increasing demand. So they've already thought about and are planning for increased day use demand, and some of their studies already speak to it. And one of the things that is under discussion now is the use of the Willamette River as a possible source of water, because our ability to draw in the Molalla is limited during certain times of year, and unfortunately those are the same times of year that we had experienced peak demand. So there are some other opportunities. The Canby Utility is actually positioned extremely well because they have water rights on the Willamette River, and many public agencies don't. So this bodes really well for the city of Canby as we look at future water needs and needs for expansion and consider the implications of our inability to draw perhaps as much as we will need out of the Molalla over the long term. So we're looking at the potential need of up to 2 million gallons per day by 2030, with that recognition already coming into play with Canby Utility as they start planning for their future. Wastewater, our per capita wastewater discharge is estimated at 80 to 100 gallons per day, which is roughly equivalent to our inside water demand. Per capita household usage at current populations is 1.28 to 1.6 million gallons per day based on 16,000 population. And we have a current capacity of our system at 2.8 million gallons per day, which means that our population could increase to 28,000 before our system is at maximum capacity. Which means we have lots of room still in our wastewater system. Stormwater collection system. This is a really interesting and potentially long-term problematic programming issue for the city of Canby. Our stormwater collection system is largely based on dry well technology, which has the potential to be challenged in any number of environmental circumstances as a potential threat to groundwater. And discussions are already kind of going on in environmental groups about potential adverse impacts associated with using a dry well system, which is what we principally use in the city of Canby. Fortunately, no definitive changes have been required, and so we're still working with what we have and working within the guidelines established for stormwater collection systems. So as I'd indicated, some potential long-term environmental issues with aquifer contamination could challenge our dry well systems. We're aware of that. We're starting to look at options that could be available, regional capture systems. There are a couple tertiary wetlands programs or projects that we're considering. One is the regional detention facility that would serve the Redwood Master Plan Development Area. It's kind of a neat wetlands design concept that sits adjacent to and behind the current wastewater treatment facility that would do a couple things. One, would act as a essentially a cleaning and management system for stormwater runoff, and second, would reestablish the wetlands in that area, which is a desirable outcome over the long term for areas adjacent to the Willamette River. And then we have the downtown regional detention facility adjacent to the police department. That deep hole that sits next to the police department could act more fully and more aggressively as a regional detention facility. As you undoubtedly know, because it's raised every time you consider a new development is now responsible to construct stormwater systems sufficient to address impacts associated with their developments. That's something you consider each time you consider a new project. Traffic transportation, really too big a topic to discuss in a setting like this because there are so many variables that are associated with it. I will say that our existing roads are sufficient to handle traffic at our current volumes, but as we all are seeing, increased traffic is going to adversely affect our road quality. We do have an aggressive road maintenance program in place that is starting to catch up to some of the maintenance issues that have been outstanding for a number of years. So we're seeing some real significant improvements within the city limits of Canby as a result of an aggressive road maintenance program supported by the road fee principally. We've noted and heard comments for several years now about increased impacts on local roads and community residents from non-local pass-through traffic. People moving from one community to another, or from one community into a job and then back out again, who are not community residents, but whose traffic is adversely impacting the quality of our roadways and our driving conditions within the city of Canby. Generally, there's not anything we can do to that, as the Highway 99 is not within our control, and roads are public right-of-way, and people have a right to drive on them. Our goals and objective will continue to be to try to find ways to mitigate to the greatest extent possible the impact on non-collector roads, and see if we can encourage traffic to stay mostly located on our roads that are designated collector roads. Certainly a long-term project, but one that we recognize is a priority in the community for the quality of life of residents in the different areas of Canby that are seeing higher than would be expected traffic counts as a result of this regional pass-through traffic. Long-term, we would hope the use of transit modal transportation systems can help lessen the impacts of both local and non-local traffic. And just kind of almost a parenthetical comment, the effect of our railroad will become more pronounced as traffic volumes increase. We see more traffic backed up waiting for the trains to pass. The trains themselves are getting longer as the economy begins to recover, and we have more commerce occurring on the rail lines, and that will definitely have an effect on the quality of life for residents in the community. Some things that we're trying to work with, quiet zones and on some of the rail interchanges, and to the extent possible, finding alternative routes that don't necessarily involve having to cross rail lines, but mostly we live with the railroad, and we do the best we can. It's just something that we have to acknowledge exists in the city of Canby, and plan as best we can. Kind of a final note on population, and I apologize, you can't read this. This is the Portland State study that was done, and if any of you have any interest in it, I'll be happy to provide you a more readable version of these slides if you want to use them for other purposes. But our current population estimates and population growth do differ from study to study. While population growth has slowed in recent years, and we estimate it's less than 1% in the last 12 months, our longer-term trend does suggest annual growth in excess of 2%. An underlying consistent theme, this is kind of a parting note, however, is that available developable land within the city's urban growth boundaries is likely to be in very limited supply by around 2030, which means that we know how much land we have to grow into, we know what our restrictions are, we know what our growth indicators are, and frankly, one of the inhibitors in that growth will be the availability of platted lots to grow into, since the city of Canby requires voter approval anytime an annexation occurs. So growth, to some extent, will be dictated by the residents of Canby in approving or denying annexations over the years. Because there seems to be pent-up demand, and I think that the last election was good proof of that, it's likely that we'll see some pretty robust growth for the next few years until supply and demand begin to balance a little bit, and until we see the next major growth spurt. But the economy being what it is, we'll see ups and downs as we have over the last 20 years. That concludes my comments. Really, I wasn't trying to create anything definitive, but just trying to show how all of the different types of services that we depend on day in and day out, and for the most part take for granted, as always, having been here and always will be here, have an interrelationship that affects every decision that you make as planning commissioners and the city council makes as it considers land use opportunities that may exist in the future. And this certainly isn't an exhaustive study, but only one to try to develop a correlation between what we have, what we can foreseeably accomplish, and what obstacles stand in the way between the two.
Will you be representing the city's interests to local legislators, or will that be Mr. Hudson, the mayor, or both?
Well, it probably relating to the undesignated lands.
No, relating to our land use system.
Oh.
I mean, as you just pointed out here for the last 35 minutes, we can point out and see the obvious errors in the Oregon land use planning system, where cities are artificially constrained by these things called urban growth boundaries that were created in Oregon, and is going to create problems with cities that are wholly constrained and retained inside of the existing bubbles. And so our land use planning system, as it currently sits, cannot last forever. Geographically and physically, it won't work forever. So there's going to have to be a change to it. And so I'm wondering whether you would be advocating for that, or the mayor, or who we would have look to help, and can be a small part, look to fixing that.
I think that it's a combination of those two and many other agencies throughout the state of Oregon. I think that the tipping point is not going to occur in the short term, and that was the genesis of my initial question to you, because I think the tipping point will come when the demand for developable land within the urban growth boundaries is greater than the available supply, and we're not at that critical point yet, and I think that a legislative fix is going to be delayed for at least an interim period of time, until such time as the pent-up demand cannot be, or the existing demand cannot be met by the lands identified within the urban growth boundaries. Now, we do have a peculiar advantage in Canby because we have the undesignated lands, and there are substantial holdings in that area. So the rural reserves do not restrict us relative to what occurs within those undesignated lands. However, it's my perception, and I believe it's correct, that our movement out into those undesignated areas that I identified in the map will be driven largely by the inavailability or unavailability of lands within the urban growth boundaries. I think that beginning to exhaust the lands that are already designated for future growth is going to be the trigger for successfully lobbying for an expansion of the urban growth boundaries to encompass lands currently classified as undesignated. And so I know it's not quite the answer that you want, where we always have these conversations, and virtually there are many cities in Oregon that are in the same position that Canby is in relative to looking at its long-term growth and looking at the restrictions associated with the urban growth boundaries and saying this just isn't going to work. We're in, I think, a little more favorable position because we have a place to go in the undesignated where a lot of cities don't, but it's still going to take something more than just the city of Canby lobbying for the change to occur.
So are these undesignated areas an exception to the priority system for urban growth boundary expansion? I'm not familiar with how that works.
They are an exception both to the rural reserve and the urban growth boundary definition. They are just what they say they are. They haven't been designated for long-term reserve, nor have they been included legislatively in the definition of what the city of Canby can look like within the urban growth boundaries. So they're potentially available to us when we can make the argument that we don't have the ability to continue to grow within the confines that have been established within the urban growth boundaries. And it puts us in kind of a peculiarly good position long-term, but in the near term, and we want, I'll tell you where our legislative battle may come at some point in the future. It may come in preserving those lands as designated as undesignated, preserving those as identified as undesignated, rather than having them be captured in the rural reserves. That's where I could potentially see an argument if an environmental consideration concern started looking at undesignated lands on a statewide basis. That's where I would see our battle really occurring in the short term.
Has there been any discussions at the city fathers level of the traffic situation? Not that it's terrible now, but as we all know, Ivy and 99W can get really crowded, and with this increased growth that we're looking at, some alternative underpass, overpass, who knows what. I know when we had one of our city meetings quite a couple years ago, one of the groups came up with an idea of putting the railroad underground through Canby, which is never going to fly with the railroad, but sooner or later something's going to have to happen with this intersection over here, because it's just going to get to the point where it's going to be gridlock at certain times.
It is, and it does pose a difficulty, and there isn't a solution. There have been all kinds of discussions. There are several factors. One is railroad right-of-way, and obviously that's all federally defined. That the rights and responsibilities of the rail is all established in federal law. In fact, that 99 is a state highway and not within the local jurisdiction, and so we control, in your instant example, Ivy, and you have to have a partnership with all of the affected agencies, which would include the state of Oregon, the rail, and the city, to effect a long-term solution to the Ivy situation, and there are other interchanges that have the same types of problems. You know, it may be over the long run that we see an overpass that occurs somewhere other than within this 5-block region right in the center of town that tries to direct regional traffic out across another overpass that has more land mass to accommodate it. It's difficult to make the types of interchanges that you're describing, which are wonderful to do, but usually you end up having to relocate businesses to accomplish it because you have to have more land area
Certainly.
to
Extremely costly.
facilitate the developments. So, I mean, I think that the opportunities probably are to look to other land that the city owns or can acquire, maybe just to the west of us, and in order to find ways to get across the rail system without having to wait for the trains to stop. But again, it all parallels Highway 99, so it all affects how we come back in.
Yes.
Any other discussion points anybody had, or was that the end of the presentation?
All I have.
What about ODOT right now? They've started their light project. Are they continuing that? Is that going to get finished?
Yes,
anytime soon?
they're starting it in earnest now. They started it about a week ago, and we expect them to work through depending on who you talk to. I think the next 6 weeks or so to complete the project, but they encountered some underground issues that they hadn't expected when they initially undertook the project, so had to postpone it, and they're tackling it again, and we expect that they'll be successful this time.
Great. Brian, any thoughts? You've been here a long time.
Really, I think this is good stuff for planning commissioners to kind of be aware of, because we focus on the incremental, and sometimes we don't stand back to see the overall picture. And we're sitting pretty good for several years in terms of capacity to accommodate the growth.
You know, and that is one, and I think that's a great point that Brian just mentioned, and that is that we have some long-term challenges, but our current circumstance is such that we have capacity in every major support category, infrastructure category, and that's not the case in all jurisdictions. We have capacity in water, we have capacity in stormwater, and we have capacity in our wastewater systems, and so that's good.
Well, there's
And I
one
would-
intangible too, and that's quality of life. That doesn't really enter into the black and white figures. That's the reason I came out to Canby out of Portland's quality of life. So,
And actually, very honestly, that's the reason that I am in Canby, for the quality of life, and it's something that I hold very dearly. So this study was important to me, and I think Brian will tell you that I talked his ear off and I asked 1,000 questions, and he responded every time, because it's important to me that for as long as I'm here and as long as I have any influence over the growth that occurs in the community, that we do it in an appropriate fashion, so that at the end of the day we are a community of residents, and that quality of life doesn't suffer at the expedience of trying to put up a bunch of houses and new development, and that we don't forget that there are people that live in this community that live here because they embrace the quality of life, and we want to preserve the quality of life. So we need to make sure that as we grow as a community, we do it intelligently. And I know intelligent growth is not necessarily considered a wonderful thing to talk about, but I think that we do it with a conscience, and maybe would describe it the best way. That's all I have.
Great.
Thank you.
So with that, I guess we will go on a short break for about 10 minutes before we call the meeting to order.